This is Criteria. Welcome back to Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, everyone. I'm James Majewski here with my co-host Thomas V. Miras. Hey,
Hello.
Thomas.
Hello.
And it's the most wonderful time of the year, or it's about to be shortly by the time this episode comes out. And we tend to try to do some sort of liturgical, seasonally appropriate episode under such occasions. I think one year we did It's a Wonderful Life. This year we had some Christmas movies that we were thinking about, but those got the boot. They got the boot because a book has just been published by Word on Fire. We're here today talking about Popcorn with the Pope, a guide to the Vatican Film List, which many people are not familiar with, the Vatican Film List, that is. But our listeners certainly will be. Of course, we've just been going through this entire film list. We completed it earlier in the year. Took us about 3 years to do so, watching every single film, talking about them in detail. And that's basically the project that's been done here. We've got the three co-authors of this book, David Paul Baird, Andrew Petiprin, and Father Michael Ward, joining us today to talk about it. And sorry, what makes this seasonally appropriate is that it could make an excellent gift. A stocking stuffer.
Okay.
Huh? See how I did
cool.
that? Yeah,
I was wondering how you were going to tie it in somehow.
Well, yes, thank you to all of our guests for being here. Thomas, would you please just take a moment to introduce them properly?
Yes. So Father Michael Ward is a Catholic priest who works at the University of Oxford and is an expert on the writing of C.S. Lewis, about whom he has written several books. That's certainly how I first heard about him. Father Michael has also reviewed films and plays for the Catholic Herald, BBC Radio, and elsewhere, and has been an actor or extra in a number of different movies. Welcome, Father Michael.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, James. Good to be with you.
Okay, guest number 2, David Paul Baird is an award-winning film critic and visiting professor of theology at Catholic Pacific College. He has a PhD in divinity as well as degrees in English, philosophy, and theology. And he has been on this podcast before because he discussed The Leopard with us when we were going through the Vatican Film List. David, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Thomas. Good to be here.
And finally, Andrew Petiprin. We've been waiting for a while to get you on because we've been communicating for a while, and we all met at the Catholic Imagination Conference last year at the University of Dallas. Andrew Petiprin is a columnist at Catholic World Report and a host of the Ignatius Press podcast, as well as the founder and editor of the Spe Salvi Institute. From 2020 to 2023, he was Fellow of Popular Culture at the Word on Fire Institute, where he created the YouTube series Watch With Me and wrote the introduction to the Book of Acts for the Word on Fire Bible. That I didn't know until I read your Bible. Your bio. Welcome, Andrew, to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Thomas and James. Good to see you again.
All right. Well,
another reason this episode is notable is because this is the largest number of guests we've had on the show yet.
That's true. I've never done a podcast with more people than this one. So let me ask a basic question to start off with, which is how this book came about. And I understand that, David, you're perhaps the best suited to answer that one.
Okay, yeah. So I was introduced to the list by a friend in graduate school, Polish guy, Grzegorz Wojtyła, a good friend I met out there, and so appropriate last name as well, given the origin of the list. And I just sort of casually started watching the films. And as I would sort of mention it to a friend, I have been watching this, there's a list. I think without fail, every person that I mentioned it to is like, oh, I didn't even know there was such a list. And this included priests and Catholic people and theologians, so people you would think that, like, if the list was a known thing, that they would know about it. And I don't think anyone ever said, oh yeah, that list. So as these reactions kept coming in, I thought, maybe this is something that more people should know about. So contacted my good friend, Father Michael Ward, with whom I had watched many movies in the past, asked if he might be interested to come along. And then when we started talking Word on Fire, it also seemed that their resident film critic, Andrew Petiprin, would be a valuable addition as well.
Well, I'll just add, I was invited into the project late, as it were. David and Michael were already off and running, and I ended up splitting some of Michael's duties. And I just want to say, I was working at Word on Fire when David and Father Michael sent the proposal in, and Brandon Vaught sent it to me and said, hey, just want to see if you think this is a good sounding book. And I said, oh my goodness, this sounds like a perfect book. I can't wait to read this book. And then it was a few months later that I became one of the authors on the book. So I was just delighted to get to be a part of this project. It's really wonderful.
Excellent. And just to set the stage. Oh, go ahead, Father Michael. Yeah.
When David pitched the idea to me, I thought, oh, what a good idea. And then when he said in particular that the proposed title would be Popcorn with the Pope, I almost bit his hand off because I said, excellent title. A book with that title is bound to sell. And every time I've told anybody about this book as I've been working on it and have got to the title, they've always laughed or smiled or said, what a great title. Anyway, I perhaps rather too enthusiastically got on board because I then turned out I didn't have enough time to do my half of the list. And that's why Andrew very kindly stepped in and helped me out. So Andrew and I have written a quarter each, and David has done the other half.
Excellent. Yeah. And just, for the listeners now, I know many of our listeners already know what the Vatican Film List. I'm not going to go into great detail explaining it, but just for anybody who might be new, I shouldn't take for granted that you know what the list is. This list came out in 1995. We've talked about it so much. We've gone into the history of this list exhaustively. But just one more time, and then this is the last time I'm ever going to explain what the Vatican Film List is again on this podcast. List of 45 films. It was titled Some Important Films, and this list was sent out by the Pontifical Council for Social Communication to various bishops' conferences around the world, just to to promote reflection on the art of cinema and its religious and moral values as well as its artistic value. The list is divided into 3 categories of 15 films each: religion, values, and art. Very, very interesting list. There's many of them are all-time classics, recognized by, religious and non-religious critics alike. And some of them are kind of like a little bit off the wall picks that everybody sort of scratches their heads at, but some of them are, delightful discoveries nonetheless. So that's the Vatican Film List. Everybody now knows. Don't ask me again. And so here we are. Yes. So where should we start? Just talking about. We were excited to compare notes with you because not many other people have done this project. There's been a little bit of revived interest in the list. Now you guys may know that around the time our podcast started in May 2020, and at that same time, a bunch of Dominican friars also started a podcast called Friars and Film, where they were also going through the Vatican Film List. Now, I don't think they've put an episode out in a while, and they haven't gone through the whole list, but it's just interesting that there's all this revived interest. So what do you all think is going on? Maybe I can ask that question with this revived interest in the Vatican Film List in the past few years.
I have no idea.
I think, obviously this book was published by Word on Fire, and I think that's significant. When I became Catholic, I was drawn to Bishop Barron. I ended up, getting to work for Bishop Barron, but one of the things that most intrigued me was his commentaries on films. And Bishop Barron, among others, has brought in, a moment, I suppose, where films are important to people exploring the Catholic faith. And the Vatican Film List, as you said a moment ago, is this sort of hidden treasure. People don't know about it. And it just seems to me the most logical starting place, as you guys know from your project, to kind of start, carry forward this conversation about faith and film. And by the way, while I have the microphone, I'll just say this really quickly to David's point earlier about people not knowing about the list. When we were writing our introductory chapter, we wanted to reach out to some people who might know a little something about how the list was compiled. I wrote an email to none other than George Weigel, who ended up endorsing our book, who George Weigel himself had never heard of the list, which is really shocked us. It really did. And, no offense to George, he's great, but it just goes to show you how little known this is. And so it's a good place to start talking about faith and film.
And for those who don't know, why is it shocking that George Weigel hadn't heard of the list?
Well, because he literally wrote the book about John Paul II. So, I mean, that was, he was in Rome a lot. He was talking to John Paul II. He knew everybody at the Vatican in the 90s when the list came out. So he did tell me, by the way, that John Paul II was not much of a film guy. He was a theater guy, didn't really watch movies, but that near the end of his life, he loved Life is Beautiful, Roberto Benigni's film, which, of course, came out too late to be included in the Vatican Film List, but great film nonetheless.
Yes. But yeah, this is all interesting. And, if you want to find out about the history of the list, you have to go deep into the bowels of Vatican bureaucracy and find the right email address of somebody to ask questions. I mean, I think I reached out to just JD Flynn, I think, because I just thought maybe he knows somebody in the Vatican that I could email. He's a journalist. Maybe he will. And he told me someone, and then they sent me to another. It wasn't a dicastery. It was some kind of congregation or something, pontifical institute of some kind. And then they sent me to another one. And then a few weeks later, I finally got an email back from a woman who had been involved with the drafting of the list. But, it was the way in which she even got my email is mysterious to me. I don't know by which person got me in touch with her at the end of the day.
Father Michael, can I ask you what your history of familiarity may be with the Vatican Film List? Was this something that you were aware of when it was being promulgated or before working on this project at least?
No, I didn't know a thing about it until David pitched the idea to me. I was a complete ignoramus on the subject. But to follow up on what Andrew said, Bishop Barron, with his film commentaries and those 10-minute videos he did on YouTube, they've been so successful, I think, in drawing people who wouldn't necessarily have much interest in Christianity or the church or matters theological. But because he's, as it were, going into the mainstream popular culture and talking about, say, Shawshank Redemption, which is the very first thing that I ever saw Robert Barron speak about. In fact, it was David who put me onto it in the first place. That was what got me acquainted with Word on Fire, and I've now published two books with Word on Fire. But Barron has shown how successful that can be as a method of evangelism and catechesis too, and I think that might have snowballed into this growing interest in the Vatican Film List.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that this is, just sort of all of a piece with the church's playbook, with engaging the culture and evangelization. And another thing that occurs to me now too is that, well, when Bishop Barron was initially reviewing films and talking about them on YouTube, films like The Departed or something, there was still the film culture wasn't quite as depressed as it is now. There was still, I would say, like a certain caliber of films coming out of Hollywood that maybe was dwindling, and as you saw this upswell of superhero and the marvelization of cinema, but I think that maybe one impetus behind turning to something like the Vatican Film List and rediscovering it is a need to go back to find more great cinema to watch, because it's not so much coming out now. I mean, it's there, but it's maybe a little hidden.
I think also perhaps Catholic filmmakers and Christian filmmakers have reached a certain point in the past couple of years where there's a much higher level of craft than there used to be in terms of cinematography and things like that, just in the religious filmmaking world. It still has a long way to go, but there's like a certain bedrock of professionalism, I think, that's been met in certain quarters that maybe has gotten us to the point where we're looking for, like, okay, so what's the next thing? Like, how can we make this better? How can we make this deeper? How can we start to make films that aren't just like competently made by Hollywood standards, but like actually, would stand the test of time? And so I think that's something that we're all sort of looking for as well. I don't know if you guys would agree with that assessment of the current state of things, but
yeah, I think those are two great points. I was writing a film review column every other week for a while I was living in Canada, and my fellow writer for the paper, we alternated weeks. It came to a point where he was not even reviewing new films anymore. He was just like going back and reviewing films that he I'd watched before. I think it just kind of speaks to maybe what you were saying, James, about this sense of like wanting to go deeper. So maybe like attention redirecting to the archives because of the kind of state of what's coming out in general.
Yeah, it does seem like I can't believe I'm going to say this in front of Michael Ward, the C.S. Lewis expert, but I mean, it reminds me of Lewis's comment about how we ought to read 3 old books for every one new book. I think maybe we've reached a point in cinema where we have like such a large backlog of wonderful things that we sort of have enough, more than enough, right, to do that. And maybe if we do watch 3 and then 3 old ones and try a new one, then we can maybe move forward with better new ones.
Yeah, and also it's worth pointing out, in the last 25 years, we've had the internet, which means that old films are so much more accessible. We point this out in our introduction to the book, that a lot of these old movies, especially the ones from the very earliest days of cinema, the silent movies, the early talkies, would not have been easily available even in your local video shop. You'd have had to go to a specialty store to find it. And now with just, 3 clicks of a mouse, you can find many of these on YouTube. So everybody is, just much more easily becoming literate in cinema history, cinema criticism. So I think that also plays into this growth of interest in the list.
Yeah.
And I really hope that this podcast and now this book can be a resource for people going through the list and beginning to sort of wade into the waters of deeper engagement with cinema, with these films in particular. I know that was part of us beginning this podcast, was just wanting to, learn for ourselves, but also model to our audience sort of what it might look like to grapple with these films. But what you've got here is a really nice little cheat sheet, if you will, a quick little synopsis and then a more incisive discussion of every single film, followed by discussion questions, and everything is very beautifully arranged. Word on Fire.
And nice pictures. Yeah,
totally awesome.
Yeah, and each film gets kind of like a 5 or 6 page essay devoted to it, which is really nice. I mean, it's interesting to see that given sort of an equal amount of space given to every film on this list. So like Lavender Hill Mob kind of gets as much space as a much more sort of classic regarded film. And I like to see like, okay, so what are they going to do with Lavender Hill Mob? A really fun film, but not something anybody would have expected to be on this list. So it's nice to see, okay, what is he going to do in 5 or 6 pages on, the earliest film on the list, The Life and Passion of Christ from, 1905 and things like that. It's kind of fun to compare notes, but also to see if you give yourself the discipline, which is sort of what we did. We said like, we're going to discuss each of these films individually in, 45 to 90 minute episodes, and just that forces you to just look more closely at whatever it is, no matter what the film is. So I'm curious at, what all of your experience was just, subjecting yourself to this kind of this project and what you discovered in that process.
I found it was surprisingly demanding project. I figured there would be some unfamiliar things, but kind of like you're saying, that to treat each film individually, especially for some of these films like the Fellini films and Tarkovsky, it's like there are whole books dedicated to these films. And so and we had 45 of these to kind of like each one with like a small library behind it of like specialist work that had already been done. And so to kind of wade through that a little bit, and to pick out to do something write something short and pithy relatively for each of these was surprisingly challenging, in that each one demanded, I don't want to speak for my co-authors, but each one I found demanded much more time and effort than I was expecting. But I hope that the outcome of that is that it creates something that's like a ramp for the readers to kind of get into many of these films which might otherwise be inaccessible or kind of forbidding.
Yeah, even though all of us have written about movies, none of us approached our chapters as if we were film scholars per se. We're appreciators of cinema, and so we watched and then we reflected, And so we hope that that comes through in the chapters, that we're not trying to necessarily, teach a class on the Vatican Film List, although I think at this point that would be a lot of fun actually if the three of us could do that. But rather we're just, trying to introduce people to the list because we ourselves were being introduced to the list.
Yes, I mean, some of the films naturally lent themselves to the kind of review that I typically like to write, which is sort of theologically informed. I study the theological imagination as a topic. That's why I'm so interested in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So turning to a film like Babette's Feast, say, or The Mission, or A Man Full Seasons, those very naturally lay themselves out for that sort of analysis and dissection. But like you say, the Lavender Hill Mob, which is, you might think a fairly thin, in terms of content, kind of social comedy. How do you get theological teeth into that sort of work? But I found that you could actually, because of this discipline, that you had to write basically the same amount of pages, same amount of words on each work, and from roughly the same sort of critical perspective, it forced you to think more deeply into these movies than you otherwise might have done. And I found that quite fruitful and interesting, but also, like David said, quite demanding.
Yeah, we definitely found similarly. Sometimes I would just really be dreading recording a particular episode. Like, oh my goodness, what are we going to even say about this movie?
Yeah.
But then sort of entering into the discussion and yes, committing to the task, to the discipline of it, really, you end up unlocking quite a bit. And maybe you can't do that with every single film ever, but I think it says something about the Vatican Film List itself, that all of the films seem to lend themselves well to this type of analysis and discussion. And it's funny, Father Michael, just as you're naming these different films, I can feel the excitement welling up within me. Like, oh man, I want to talk about all of these. But unfortunately, our time is limited and we can't talk about all of these. So I don't know, I know that in our recap episode, where we did attempt to try to talk about all of them, we did ask some bigger picture questions.
Yeah.
Maybe we can talk about some of that.
Well, I'm going to ask a very, very generic question before getting into specific themes, which is I just wanted to ask you, not to overlook this question, is what do you think of the list as a whole, and what's your evaluation of it? So I want to give you each a chance to just sort of make some general comments about what you think of it.
So this is just what I'm thinking in this moment. But sorry, Andrew, did you want to go first? Okay. I would say just as sort of spontaneous enjoyment, I would say maybe 1/3 of the movies probably qualify for that for me. Maybe another third where it's interesting, thought-provoking, intellectually stimulating, cinematic fare. And then, I don't know, maybe another 1/3 or 20% where it's a bit of a head scratcher. I'm like, wow, I don't think I would ever watch that one. And don't know if I'll watch it again, but I'm kind of glad to have, trod through that part of the library. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great, the list is, I think, is a great introduction to just unfamiliar territory. In that, I don't know, for most people, how many average movie watchers have watched any movie that was made before 1980, for example?
Sure.
And so I think this is a nice kind of rock skipping across the water back through time to just see some moments of just even the development of cinema. So for anybody who's got just even a little bit of a cinema nerd inside of them, I think this is a great way to kind of just have an introduction to different, I don't know, points on the map.
Right. Well put.
I think David's experience might be slightly different than mine or Michael's, just because he got to watch so many more films and write about so many more films than Michael or I did. But I have to say, the 11 films that I got to write about, I liked all 11 of them very much. And I've had a chance to write about some of the other films on the list that I wasn't assigned for for this book, and I like those films very much too. So I feel like I really lucked out in my set. And my experience also included rewatching things I wasn't sure that I did like. One of the biggest ones for me was 2001: A Space Odyssey, which I had seen but I did not remember liking very much. And I came away really loving it. I think it's great. I think it's brilliant. So, and there were one or two others like that on my list. So I really love that. The other thing I would just say about the list is the way that it's divided in the three categories is really important. I think that it's whether you pick those three words or other ones, I think it's really important that the church is saying with the list, they're just different types of films that need to be kind of understood in different kinds of ways that serve different kinds of purposes. So it's not just an all or nothing, like, yes, this is acceptable, no, this goes on the condemned list, right? It's much more complicated than that, because art is. And I think that's the crowning glory of the list, is this real stamp of approval from the church that cinema is a great art form. And indeed, I would say the great art form today. So anyway, I think the list is just terrific. And my experience of it was very satisfying for my 11 chapters.
And
yeah, I think that is...
I was going maybe just to add to that quickly, Andrew, this I think one thing the other three categories does is it kind of gives us permission to appreciate films in different ways. It's like, just kind of riffing on what you said, is like, we can appreciate a film just for like the art of it, the list seems to say, or we can find meaningful human values in films even if they're not explicitly Christian films. So I think, just to add to that, I think it offers us more approaches to cinema and more ways to appreciate.
Father Michael?
I agree with what my co-authors have said. The list has many values, many virtues. It's also, when you think about it objectively, dispassionately, it's quite idiosyncratic. Just the fact that it's 45 films surveying the first century of cinema, you might think, why didn't you choose 100 films? Or why didn't you choose 50 films?
Was it like a handy 2.25 films per year?
I presume they went for 45 because it does divide easily into three. And presumably they had come up with the categories before they came up with the list. And so it's, in that sense, a rather peculiar kind of product. And one oddity, which I still can't quite understand, the inclusion of a decalogue, which is not a single film. It's 10, TV movies of about an hour in length. It's very, very odd to have that on the list, I think. And I, in a way, wish they hadn't included it. I wonder whether it's not evidence of the Polishness of the pontiff at the time.
Have you seen the Decalogue films?
I haven't, no.
Okay. Well, there you go. Maybe if you watch them, you'd have a deeper understanding of why they're on the list.
Well, yeah, but still, my point is not that they're good or bad. It's just that they're not a single movie.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting question, because there is no other series of films that's included, and then there are some films that I'm trying to think if there are any films that are part of a series that the other films are not included. I
don't think so.
Napoleon comes to mind, but that
technically, as the rest of the series was never made. So,
but no, I appreciate what you're saying, Father, about this sort of idiosyncratic nature of the list, and it's sort of right there in the title. Some important films. There's something kind of I don't know. To me, it somehow makes it feel more human, because it's more eclectic and it's not just, here's the best of the best, top 100. It feels, I don't know, sometimes I have this experience at Mass where I look around and I'm like, wow, look at this like hodgepodge of people, just all sorts of different, people, and that's kind of represented somehow on this list. It's not just the most glamorous films or the most important films or even there's a certain,
or even all the films that could have been or maybe should have been.
Sure.
put on there even by a single director. I mean, I think it's really interesting, for example, that for Tarkovsky, we have Andrei Rublev and The Sacrifice, which are, I think, no doubt, are great films that belong on that list. But why not Nostalgia? Why not Stalker? I think a good case could be made for that. Bergman, I mean, I think the choices for him are good, but they're, why not Winter Light? Or, I don't know, a number of other films that could have been picked, I think. So, I mean, I guess the point is like you can't, just give a sampling of the greats or whatever it may be, but it's still that what you pick and you don't pick is notable, and it sparks discussion.
I think there's also a decision to that I think would be harder to justify today, which was to include 2 films from several directors. Like we have 2 Fellini, 2 Tarkovsky, 2 Bergman films,
2 Rossellini, 2
which,
Dreyer.
Given the kind of explosion in cinematic production today, I think it would be hard to justify putting.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And to your point, Father, about the sort of, the Polish character of the pontiff at the time, the list itself too is very Italian.
Oh yeah.
So, it's dominated by Italian cinema.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there's whole other genres of cinema that just aren't anywhere to be seen. Film noir, for instance, sort of looms large as a big omission.
Right.
Yeah, French cinema. Why Eric Romaire's not on there? I mean, that's really
Right.
strange.
Yeah. We wondered about that ourselves. I wanted to ask a general question, but a little more focused on sort of a theme that I kept coming back to when we were going through the list. And that is this commonplace that you sometimes hear, and I don't know if you all have heard this, that the best religious films are made by non-religious directors, or that this is sort of this is something to be observed in the landscape of cinema. And I found myself reevaluating that commonplace as I went through the list. But at least the sense in which that commonplace might be understood. And I wanted to know what you guys think of that sort of phenomenon of many of these classic religious films on the list being made by either non-believers or non-practicing members of, say, Catholicism or whatever religion, whatever branch of Christianity. And what do you think? What was your sort of what was your I know you all didn't watch every film on the list individually, but what's your overall impression of kind of the state of the canon of religious cinema in relation to the actual beliefs or non-beliefs of the directors? Maybe starting with David.
Well, I don't know, a few thoughts off the top of my head. One is that having faith is not the same thing as being a talented artist, for example. And while I think we can maybe say something like the faith can enhance and perfect who we are as human persons, it's maybe just an independent variable, what artistic skill a given individual has. So I don't know that just sort of being a practicing Catholic, for instance, gives you a free pass to being something special in regards to creating great piece of music or a great movie or whatever. And on that note, I don't know that we've just really had so many Catholic filmmakers, have we? I mean, there have been some across time, but it's almost I don't know, 90-something% of movies are made by non-believer people. I'm just making up that number, but one, I guess, if that generalization holds true, it's another thought that there are certainly exceptions. So for me, this film, Tree of Wood and Clogs, was my kind of favorite discovery on the list, made by a practicing Catholic director, as far as I'm aware. And there's just a beautiful holiness that suffuses that whole film. So if the kind of statistically it skews one way, I think there are definitely exceptions that having a faith can actually add a real value to the film that a given director makes.
And if I can just maybe specify the question a little bit more before giving the other two of you a chance to answer it. One thing I'm sort of going at with this is not the question of the cinematic quality of films made by non-believers, but how specifically religious some of these films are. Like, as I found myself watching many of these classic great religious films, even something like A Man for All Seasons, I found myself questioning at certain points, I love this movie, but how deeply is this a religious film? Or is this truly about religion, or is it about something else that's sort of connected to religion? So it wasn't so much about, yes, I think we can agree there are many great, great films that involve religion that are made by non-religious filmmakers, but maybe reevaluating that cliche that can a non-religious person really make a great film that is truly at its core, a religious film? And I guess that raises a lot of other questions, but that's sort of the question that I'm wondering about, and wanted to sort of give you the other two of you the chance to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. A couple of the films that I reviewed were The Flowers of St. Francis by Rossellini and Nazarene by Luis Buñuel. And I'll just use those as examples of how this is complicated and interesting. Rossellini obviously was culturally Catholic, raised Catholic, but not really a practicing Catholic by the time he's making movies. He makes The Flowers of St. Francis as a kind of gift to his homeland in response to the horrors of World War II, that what Europe needed was a figure like St. Francis. And Cardinal Roncalli, the future John the 23rd, sees the film and he says, "Oh, my poor boy, you don't know what you've done." And I relate that in some ways to Fellini's 8.5 too. That it's like you can't. It's like the wonderful thing is faith. The faith is so powerful that you can't get away from it, and you keep turning to it. Strangely, even in your doubt, as kind of the answer to the questions. Then connected then to Buñuel's Nazarene, that is a weird movie, and I came away really liking that movie. But it's a movie about a radical priest who sort of this idealistic priest who wants to own nothing and just sort of have this radical Christ-like ministry. But my takeaway from that movie is he's the one who needs the ministry at the end. He's the one who's like receives this weird gift of this pineapple from this woman on the road, and it's all very strange. But I think it's like a profound thing from a filmmaker, Buñuel, who said, "I'm an atheist, thank God." It's like strangely like he wanted to make a movie about this like religious man who's kind of inept, but it's very touching to me, and I think a very powerful religious film that it shows a priest who is like trying to serve the Lord, and ultimately the takeaway is the Lord needs to kind of bless him. So I don't know, it's complicated. I totally agree with David's point about artists. I mean, that's it. Art is complicated.
Father Michael?
Obviously, we, just as human beings, we tend to write about and explore best the things we know best. So if we know from inside the faith, that ought, all things being equal, to equip us better to make films about it. And contrariwise, those who are outside it, who lack that subjective knowledge, are at a disadvantage. But all things are not equal, because a lot of non-believers have superior artistic skills and greater capacity for imagination than a given believer might have. So it's complicated. You can't draw up general rules about the matter. Thomas, you mentioned A Man for All Seasons and whether that is really a religious film or not. And I had exactly the same question. I don't know if you've had a chance to read my review yet, but
I did, yeah.
I thought the more I pressed into A Man for All Seasons, which I think is a great movie, the more I began to see that Robert Bolt was indeed, as he said he was, presenting Thomas More much more as a hero of private conscience than as a strictly Christian martyr. It's the fact that it is he who holds this belief that matters, not what it is that he believes. So that made me wonder whether Robert Bolt wasn't slightly at a disadvantage. But then, interestingly, and Robert Bolt isn't a Christian, wasn't a Christian. Robert Bolt also is responsible for the screenplay of The Mission, which I think does quite a good job of exploring questions of forgiveness and violence and penitence and so forth. So even with that one example of Robert Bolt, you've got one where he falls down and one where he remains standing. In my estimation, I think they're both great movies, but one is possibly less obviously successful in exploring an explicitly religious theme.
Another thought building on that is that the non-religious person might in some ways have a slight edge over the practicing religious person, in that they're coming from a place where they are like conscious of and willing to ask questions. Whereas maybe for people on the inside, we're a bit more reticent or forget because things grow too familiar, that there's something deeply mysterious here that we really don't understand and could explore much more deeply. Whereas perhaps from the outside, it's more obvious to see that, or for them to feel that they don't have it figured out, and so then to go exploring.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that maybe this cliche about atheist directors, making the best religious films, it might just have something more to say about how difficult it is to make films about things that you have a very strong stake in, maybe, or maybe it's just about the act of filmmaking itself. I mean, it's notoriously difficult to get a film made, and also in a lot of instances notoriously expensive. So for a religious film to get made, even to begin with, is it already starts to you have to ask questions about where's the funding coming from and who's got the stake in this. And so anyway, shifting gears slightly, because we're running low on time, and there is one other big question that we tracked through our exploration of the film list, and still talking about religious films, but more specifically the saint film. There's a lot of saint films out there in the wilderness, and there's a lot of saint films here on this list. I haven't got the list handy, but we've got Therese, we've got a couple of films about St. Francis of Assisi, Flowers of St. Francis and Francesco,
Monsieur Vincent,
A Man for All Seasons. And so one question that kept coming up was sort of, how to depict a saint in film, or put another way, what makes a great saint film, and has one been made yet? And anything I'm missing on that?
No,
so I'll leave it open to any or all of you to respond to that if you wish.
I'll jump in. I've thought a little bit about this question. It's the films that you mentioned, the saint films on the list. There's quite a variety. And a variety of approaches. So it's hard to really generalize across, like, what do they have in common, because they're quite distinct entries. But one thing I've thought of is how I think saint films and kind of hagiographies in general can kind of die of mediocrity, to put it that way, or like just really not be so interesting at the end of the day. Is how I think somehow there's a tendency to want to depict the saint as like a finished product, like to show the saint in their like perfected saintliness, and then effectively, if like that's where the film starts, there's nowhere for them to go other than just to kind of be mistreated by everyone around them. And so I think in some ways, maybe, to generalize big picture, and not necessarily talking about the films on the list, but many of these saint movies that we can find around, is that maybe so far don't really start at the right point. Maybe we need to like find the drama inside that saint's life, and more focus this telling on like their struggle to become the saint, rather than just what their biography was for them, like being a saint for 40 years.
Yeah, one of the films that I got to review was The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I think is a tremendous saint film. I think that the intensity of it is precisely not just a kind of saccharine hagiographical thing. It's extremely psychological, and it deals with just all kinds of interesting dynamics. So I love that. To my mind, the great saint film of recent times is A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick. And I think no doubt that would be on a list if it was made. I mean, it's really hard for me to think of a better saint film than that movie, although Franz Jägerstätter, I guess, he's still a blessed or something. But I mean, the way that it depicts his struggle, his journey, also the forces of the culture upon him, I don't think you're going to top that.
And Father Michael?
Well, the only saint film I had to review was A Man for All Seasons, which we've already talked about a bit. But I mean, on David's point about where you start in the life story of the protagonist, I mean, Man for All Seasons starts quite close to the end of St. Thomas More's life, when he's already obviously acquired a great degree of holiness, and it's because he's a holy man that he stands out against Henry VIII. And that's where the real drama of his life, you might say, begins. Because, okay, you are a saintly man. Are you going to continue to be saintly even under the pressure of looming death? And that's, I suppose, the drama of A Man for All Seasons, that he's put under ever greater loads of stress. His faith is put under this stress test, and it survives, and he is martyred. And it's really largely because he was martyred that we think of him, that he has become a saint. He is a martyr saint. There are plenty of saints who aren't martyrs, but their lives tend to be perhaps less dramatic. Is that a fair generalization? Maybe not, but that's all I have to say on the topic.
Yeah, it seems to me that the saint, just taken generally, is a person of such greatness of spirit that you are almost forced to consider a kind of fragmented picture. Like you can't capture this magnanimity within an hour, 2 hours on film. That there has to be sort of a consideration of the saint under a certain aspect. And that was one impression that I had going through the different saint films on the list, was like, oh, well, yeah, this is really interesting because this really captures this aspect of this saint or whatever. But then, yeah, I think to the point that you made, David, Monsieur Vincent comes to mind as another film where St. Vincent de Paul is already a very holy man at the beginning. And we talked about this in our discussion of that film, is how it was, how interesting it was as a film, precisely because it was able to maintain interest even as this character was already quite perfect at the beginning.
Right.
But he's going deeper. So there is still growth, and you can track that. Even at the end, he's still sort of trying to get this harsh duty of sanctity is still driving him forward.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I was glad to hear this mention of A Hidden Life. Now that we've completed our survey of the Vatican Film List, we're going deep into different directors, and we've just begun our slow creep through the full filmography of Terrence Malick, and we'll be capping that with a consideration of A Hidden Life, no doubt.
Could I add just one more comment that just came to my mind as we're thinking about the saints thing? The difficulty maybe in making a saint movie is the same reason why it's difficult to make a movie about Jesus, and that's why. Am I wrong? There's no movies about Jesus on the... No, there are. There are a couple. I didn't have any. But, I mean, the list is not heavy with Jesus movies, right?
Right.
Why? It's hard to make a movie about Jesus because you're making movies about transformation, about growth, about, setbacks and redemptions and like all these things that we don't sort of consider to be characteristic of holiness, I guess.
Yeah. Thomas and James, you might take a different...
We only have a few minutes left. Go ahead.
I was just going to say something controversial that might make us talk for another hour. But I was going to say, one of my my favorite saint movie, like saint in scare quotes on the list, was Gandhi, which I felt like...
Oh, boo! Boo!
Which I felt like, however kind of accurate to the biography of the man, and so on, I felt like presented, if we take half a step back and abstract, but like shows in a really compelling way how like a virtuous person can affect like change in the world, which I think like,
Yeah.
Okay.
I would.
We had a very spicy take on that one when we talked about it.
I will say, in just talking about the book for a second, I didn't object to the generosity of the book. I think you guys were all trying to be generous with whatever movies you were discussing. The only thing that bothered me was, David, your very obvious of strong aversion to the whole genre of Italian neorealism. I was like, I just don't think Bicycle Thieves needs to be apologized for. For me, it's totally easy to sit down and enjoy. I think Tree of Wooden Clogs is a much more challenging film for your average viewer. Don't get me wrong, it's the greatest neorealist film on the list. I agree with you on that. But yeah, I don't know. I just think most of those movies are, other than maybe Passion of or Gospel According to St. Matthew, that's a little bit dry. But yeah, I love the neorealism genre in there.
Well, maybe I could just summarize it like this: is trying to articulate the the way that many people who aren't dedicated film nerds might react to the movie, which is to say, just a bit underwhelming.
I see. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, when I read your bit on Bicycle Thieves, I didn't take it so much that, you were giving it a hard time, but that, yes, you were trying to anticipate how someone who might be disinterested and then give them possible ways to enter into appreciation. But,
right. But you began your review of Tree of Wooden Clogs by saying this had the great accomplishment of being the only work of neorealism that is actually enjoyable to watch or something like that. I was just like, no. Brutal.
So yeah, I mean, I love that movie, Tree of Wooden Clogs, but the other ones I did find
great.
A bit of a challenge.
If I may, just one final question then, and we'll do this quickly since we're running out of time, but for each of you, of the films that you covered for the book, what would you most strongly recommend that our listeners go and watch? And start with you, David.
So for those who haven't seen Andrei Rublev, that would be, I think, a good place to start. It's a challenging film, but just a masterpiece of cinema. And then three others that I think...
Your essay was quite good, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Three others that maybe are lesser known, but I think are worth the time and effort, that a rewarding watch. One would be Gandhi. Sorry, guys. I really like the movie. Another one is Tree of Wooden Clogs, and the third one is the one we discussed previously on your show, which is The Leopard, which I think is just a aesthetically gorgeous movie.
I don't know if you guys knew, but just as a tangent, when we did our recap of the whole list, we did our top five. Each, me, James, and our co-host Nathan did our top five of what we liked best on the list, and we all, without coordinating it, we all picked the same number 2 and number 1. We all picked Tree of Wooden Clogs for our number 2. We all picked Andrei Rublev for our number 1. So that was kind of interesting. Okay, so Father Michael, what would you recommend people watch?
Yeah, from my 11, I can't speak to the whole of the list. So from my section of the list, my top 3 would be, in this order, gold medal to Chariots of Fire, silver medal to Babette's Feast, and bronze to Burmese Harp, which was a discovery for me. I had not heard of the movie, let alone seen it, before I started work on this book, but I thought it was excellent. Moving and sensitive and profound. A real find about, death and grief and care for the memory of the dead. It's suddenly shot into my, top 10 or top 20 films of all time.
Wow.
Right. And that's one that even many cinephiles approaching the Vatican Film List may not have seen. So that's it's just one of those interesting gems on the list, I think. Andrew?
Well, I still haven't seen Burmese Harp, actually, so I need to. My choices, though, would be, although I didn't write about it for this book, I would agree with Michael on Babette's Feast. In fact, if somebody said to me, I've never heard of the Vatican Film List, what one movie should I go and watch? I would prescribe Babette's Feast. But
that was the first one we discussed on this podcast.
Yeah, it's a magnificent movie. Among the 11 that I reviewed, I'll recommend two that I haven't talked about yet. One is Louis Malle's Au revoir les enfants. It's just a very touching movie. It's a very powerful movie about the times. So I'd recommend that one. And then the other one that I would recommend highly is Carl Theodor Dreyer's Ordette, which is a movie I had never seen before. And I'm so glad that I was given this one to watch and write about, because I think it is one of it's definitely up there with Andrei Rublev or, the most profound movies ever made, in my opinion. And the ending to me is just astonishing. I mean, I couldn't even believe it when the credits rolled. So I would highly recommend that one.
Okay, so I'm going to do like a quick lightning round and just give you each one film to add to the list. And it could be from before the list came out that they didn't include, or it could be from if we were doing an updated version of the list.
This is tricky. Is this a sneak question? It
is a sneak question. Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, can I?
But surely you have to have considered this
Can I
at some
seize
point.
the low hanging fruit here? And maybe I'll have to do another one if it's too easy one. But I would go straight to Terrence Malick's Tree of Life, which
Yeah.
Cool.
I think is one of the. And to me, it's like kind of right in the middle of kind of art house versus like cinematic watchable movies, and I think it's just profound, great film that anybody who has the patience and is not too sleepy should try to watch.
Yeah, very good.
I think my internet froze again when you were asking the question, but I think you asked what film I would add to the list. And the film that I think is just conspicuously absent from the list is Eric Romaire's My Night at Maud's. I think it's one of the great films ever, and a great Catholic film on many levels, explores the issue of Pascal's wager. I would definitely have put that on the list if I had made it.
Great. Father Michael?
Just thinking in terms of categories, one category that isn't really represented on the list is the musical. I mean, we have Fantasia, but Fantasia is on the list really for animation rather than for music. I mean, music as well, of course, but it's not a music,al in the normal.
There's Wizard of Oz on the list.
Sorry?
Wizard of Oz is on the list.
Oh, that's true. But for some reason, I don't think of that as a musical. Should I?
Well, anyway, what would you add?
I think of it more as sort of magic dream film or something.
Yeah.
That well-known genre.
No, I'm thinking of, that well-known genre. No, I'm thinking of a film that is set in reality as opposed to a dream, which is a musical. So I'm thinking of, I don't know, don't scorn me for this, but there's a reason why The Sound of Music is one of the most popular and successful movies.
That's so interesting, because James picked that to add when we did our finale.
Really?
James, well, you all picked movies that we picked in our finale, but I'm surprised that you both picked Sound of Music because it's not a religious film, so you wouldn't immediately think of it, but you both went there, so that's very interesting.
Yeah, I think it is quite a religious film, actually.
I've never seen it.
But,
I've never seen it, so I can't speak, actually.
And then, more popularly, less theologically, films like, even something like Oliver, a great telling, a musical telling of a fantastic novel by Charles Dickens. Or more latterly, this would fall outside the bounds of the list, but I think very highly of Kenneth Branagh's Love's Labour's Lost, which absolutely sank without trace on its release. But it's one of my favourite films.
It is interesting there aren't any Shakespeare adaptations on the list, right? That is curious. I hadn't thought about that before.
Did I misunderstand the question? Was I meant to pick a pre-1995 release?
No. It could have been either. Either was fine. Yeah.
Well, I've got one anyways, pre-1995, and it's Amadeus.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
I've actually never seen that myself.
Okay, this is what kind of sparked my love of cinema. I was literally dumbfounded by this movie. Like 10 minutes, I was just like sat in stunned silence. So I think this is just a really great film.
Great. Well, thank you to David, to Father Michael Ward, and Andrew. Thank you all for coming on. Thank you for writing this book. It's good. We're going to get a critical mass of different. We've got podcasts on the Vatican Film List. We now have a book on the Vatican Film List. What other media? We could do somebody should write a play about the Vatican Film List. Just to get massive, saturation, so everybody knows about this. Thanks everybody for coming on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thompson James.
All right. Anything else to say? You guys will link to the Word on Fire website where you can purchase Popcorn with the Pope, a guide to the Vatican Film List, and our next episode, I think we're going to be reviewing the new Miyazaki film, which just unexpectedly to me anyway hit theaters. So looking forward to that. And then it'll be Christmas, and we'll see you all next year. All right, everybody, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.
Criteria is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.